Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alex Neve, and I'm a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public International Affairs, and also both a visiting and adjunct professor of international human rights law here at the University of Ottawa. But most importantly, this afternoon, I'm, to say the least, deeply honored to serve as your moderator for a timely and important opportunity to engage, to hear from and to engage with three very knowledgeable and insightful speakers with respect to, it would be an understatement to describe it as a pressing and growing concern, and that is the aggressive assimilationist policies of the Chinese government in Tibet and the devastating consequences of that for human rights. Before we begin, as we gather this afternoon on the University of Ottawa campus for this important conversation, we pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. And we pay respect to all Indigenous peoples in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. And I would ask all of us to hold that acknowledgement and recognition particularly close during today's event, as there is much we will hear and learn regarding the situation in Tibet, including about occupation and dispossession, assimilationist policies, and widespread human rights concerns that, of course, resonates directly with those grievous chapters in the history of Indigenous peoples in this land and territory as well. I would now like to welcome up my colleague, Professor Roland Paris, who is the director of the Graduate School of Public International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Professeur Paris va partager quelques mots de bienvenue de la part de l'université. Roland.
Thank you very much, Alex. Undersecretary Zaya, our two esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, welcome to the University of Ottawa, and welcome also to our policy school. This event, which is presented by the Center for International Policy Studies, the Human Rights Research and Education Center, the Canada-Tibet Committee, and the United States Embassy, is very much in keeping with the mission of our school, which is to foster debate and discussion on international and domestic policy issues based on facts, solid research, and experience. I should say that while we encourage all of our members, our professors, our fellows, our students to actively engage in such debates, the school itself doesn't take an institutional position on any specific policy issues, but many of our members are particularly interested in issues of human rights and in China's behavior, both at home and abroad. So this event is both timely and very welcome. We're delighted to host all of you, especially our visitors, and I very much look forward to what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion. So once again, thank you for joining us and welcome to the University of Ottawa. And I believe I will now call upon Joya Donnelly, Director General of the Northeast Asia Division at Global Affairs Canada, to offer her own words of welcome on behalf of the department. Thank you.
Mike might be a bit high. We'll try like this. Here we go. Madame Undersecretary, bienvenue à Ottawa. Distinguished guests, panelists, Prof. Neve, Monsieur Roland Paris, colleagues from the U.S. Embassy and the diplomatic community, representatives of civil society organizations, dear faculty members, dear students. Bonjour et merci à toutes et tous d'être ici aujourd'hui. Thank you to everyone for joining us and to all who made this event possible today. Before we start, I will do exactly like you, Professor Neve. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is the traditional land and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This is something I want us to take a moment to reflect on in the context of our discussion today. As we are walking the path of reconciliation with First Nations in Canada, we are accountable to remind ourselves of what led us here, including the painful and lasting impacts of residential schools, and to honor survivors, their families, and their communities. We also need to remember the many children who never return home. To learn more and commit ourselves to the work ahead. With Canada's long, dark history of residential schools and the attempts at assimilation of our Indigenous people, we have a voice as Canadian and an important role to play with regards to what is happening in Tibet today. And we will continue to speak up in Geneva, in Beijing, and here in Ottawa. My own experience has shown me time and time again just how valuable information sharing and discussions among representatives of civil society, academia, and government is to work on international issues. Civil society advocates, academics, diplomats, we each have something important to bring to the table, and we each have limitations. This is why cooperation is so essential. Speaking as a diplomat, I can tell you that we need your ideas. We need your advice, and we even need you to challenge us sometimes. It was civil society that put the issue of colonial boarding schools on the international agenda in 2021. The UN system has taken that work and amplified it. Canada, in turn, now refers consistently to the recommendations and concerns coming out of the UN human rights systems on this issue. We continue to ask China to respond to the findings of the human rights treaty bodies, including the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Committee for the Elimination of Discriminations Against Women, and the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We also refer to concern raised by the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues on the right to education and in the field of cultural rights. You may know that during China's Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council in January, Canada joined other countries in calling upon the PRC to withdraw all coercive measures being imposed on Tibet and to allow unfettered access by the UN into Tibetan regions of China. And we haven't given up on trying to get another visit to the Tibetan Autonomous Region. Our embassy in Beijing continues to request such a visit. And now that COVID-0 is a thing of the past, well, we haven't had a positive response yet, but we are persistent. Last time a Canadian ambassador visited Tibet, I was actually serving in Beijing, and it took about 3 years of sustained follow-ups to get a yes. But we're not giving up, because many of you from academia and from civil society and from the diaspora have told us that no matter what we see or do not see during those visits, Tibetans on the ground see us, and they know that Canada and the international community has not forgotten them. Our discussion today provides an opportunity to deepen our understanding and continue our collaboration. I look forward to learning from you. Merci.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je suis vraiment ravie d'être ici à Ottawa et je vous remercie, Alex, Joya, Roland, pour vos discours très importants. Good afternoon to everyone, and I want to thank Joya and Roland for their introductory remarks and Alex for that very kind introduction. I also want to thank the Canada-Tibet Committee and the University of Ottawa for hosting today's gathering. As you know, my name is Azra Zaya, and I am proud to be the United States Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues. It's a true pleasure for me to be here today in Canada, here among one of our closest allies, alongside distinguished colleagues, experts, students, and members of the Tibetan community. Just a few weeks ago, news broke about arrests of over 1,000 Tibetans in Duga County in Sichuan's Garza, Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture. Now, in the week leading up to the arrests, religious and laypersons alike gathered to peacefully protest the construction of a dam that threatened displacement of 2 villages and 6 historic monasteries. These communities have lived in the area for generations, and the monasteries are home to hundreds of monks and priceless relics. Video footage shows PRC authorities forcibly detaining and arresting monks who pled with authorities to save their homes and their tangible symbols of their cultural heritage. The United States calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all those unjustly arrested. But this incident is but the latest example of the PRC's assimilationist or cynicization policies, from forcing the relocation of homes and monasteries to requiring monks and nuns to pledge loyalty to the state, to co-opting the traditional succession processes of Tibetan Buddhist lamas, to banning images of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. The PRC aims to subsume Tibet's rich spiritual, linguistic, and cultural traditions into its political framework. And they have wasted no time. Beginning as early as 4 years old, Tibetan children are separated from their families and coerced into government-run boarding schools, where they are purposely restricted from learning their language, celebrating cultural events like Tibetan New Year or Losar, and practicing Tibetan Buddhism. More than 1 million students, or 3 in 4 school-age Tibetan children, have been forcibly assimilated in these schools, all to serve a long-term goal of co-opting and reshaping Tibet's traditions. This contradicts commitments that countries, including Canada, the United States, and yes, the PRC, have made at the United Nations and other fora to protect not only cultural heritage, such as historic sites and artifacts, but just as importantly, the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, the traditional practices and lifeways unique to each community. But this type of forced assimilation is not unique to Tibet. Increasingly, education is a major vehicle the Chinese Communist Party uses to forcibly assimilate the PRC's rich array of ethnic and religious minority groups. The PRC's patriotic education law that went into effect in January seeks to safeguard so-called national and ethnic unity. It legislates enhanced, quote, patriotic feelings among Hong Kongers and calls for education of unification of the motherland with regards to Taiwan. And in Xinjiang, the so-called vocational training centers are euphemisms for internment and detention centers used to propagate ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs and other minority groups. And while the United States will continue to call out these coercive assimilationist policies, we are forthright in acknowledging our own history. Throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, the United States government forced the displacement of Native Americans from their lands and utilized boarding schools to assimilate Native communities and their children. But unlike the PRC, the United States, as well as our Canadian partners, believes in the fundamental importance of confronting historic wrongs and meaningfully engaging with impacted communities to ensure injustices like these never happen again. At the Department of State, we are meeting this commitment in 3 key ways. First, under the leadership of the State Department's first Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, Desiree Cormier-Smith, We launched the first ever Indigenous Youth Leadership Coalition to elevate Indigenous voices from around the world, to incorporate their invaluable perspectives into global civic and political engagement, and to address challenges to Indigenous communities that know no borders. This program expands upon many of our policy goals, from combating structural racism and promoting human rights to strengthening peacemaking and human-centered security. Secondly, we're proud to support programs that directly engage with vulnerable communities and protect both tangible and intangible cultural heritage at home and across the globe. As Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues, I oversee over $24 million in assistance to support cultural and linguistic preservation efforts in Tibetan communities, among many other activities. These funds provide critical support for historians, scholars, and religious leaders dedicated to ensuring that Tibet's rich culture can be passed down for generations to come. And finally, in coordination with allies and partners, the United States seeks to call out injustice around the globe. For example, last August, the United States announced visa restrictions on PRC officials involved in the forcible assimilation of more than 1 million Tibetan children in these government-run boarding schools. In late January, more than 20 governments, including the United States and Canada, provided recommendations at the PRC's Universal Periodic Review at the UN Human Rights Council, specifically mentioning the PRC's assimilation policies targeting members of ethnic and religious minority groups. And later this week, the United States is proud to co-sponsor with Canada an event on preservation of Tibetans' unique cultures on the sidelines of the UN Human Rights Council. My friends, we gather here today at a critical moment for Tibet. Human rights defenders, journalists, and researchers in Tibet and around the globe put themselves at personal risk to research and expose the PRC's systems of oppression that we're discussing here today. In doing so, they contend with widespread and pervasive surveillance and censorship in the PRC, and they face PRC-directed transnational repression here in Canada, the United States, and around the globe, aimed at silencing them. The PRC will likely censor the insights of today's discussion and attempt to discredit these facts through mis- and disinformation. That is why events like today's seminar are so critical. To my Tibetan friends here and around the globe who continue to speak up, the United States sees you, we hear you, and we stand with you in support of your cultural, religious, and linguistic identity. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary Zaya. That was, I think, an incredible way for us to begin our conversation this afternoon. You've powerfully, obviously, laid out the scope, gravity, extent, and unfortunately longevity of the very serious human rights concerns faced by the people of Tibet, and put that into the wider context of the human rights challenges vis-a-vis China in general. But I also think, very helpfully have pointed to the places where it's vital, multilateral settings and other opportunities to be finding the ways forward. And I think that very much sets the stage for the kind of exchange we need to be having today. So thank you for that. It is now, the pleasure continues, because now it's my honor to turn to our two esteemed panelists, Dr. Namgyal Chodep and Dr. Tashi Ragbe. Dr. Chodep is the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Office of Tibet in North America. He was born and raised in a Tibetan refugee settlement in India, where he received his basic schooling and college education. He went on to earn a master's degree in sustainable international development from Brandeis University and a PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. His academic career has included numerous research endeavors and publications in such areas as Tibetan refugees and migration, and contemporary Tibetan societies in India and Nepal. In December of 2021, Dr. Chodap took up the role of representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration to North America, based at the Office of Tibet in Washington, D.C. Dr. Tashi Rabge is research professor of international affairs at the Elliott School at the George Washington University, where she directs the research initiative on multi-nation states and the Tibet Governance Lab. Dr. Rabge has a PhD from Harvard, a master's in international law from the University of Cambridge, and a law degree from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She was previously a lecturer at the University of Virginia, where she was co-director of the university's Tibet Center. She's currently a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Her accomplishments and contributions, which you will find online, are too extensive to list. Dr. Rabge, along with her family here in Ontario, is a co-founder of Machik, a nonprofit organization dedicated to Tibetan empowerment. And I would be remiss if I did not bring to your attention and congratulate her on the fact that she and her family were recently awarded the Meritorious Service Cross by Governor General Mary Simon in recognition of those efforts, in particular for supporting Tibet language-based education. So I think between our two panelists, we have a lot that we're going to hear about and learn. And Dr. Chodap, I believe you are going to begin. Yes.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I would like to pay my homage and respect to the people of the First Nations. And I would like to thank University of Ottawa, CTC, and USA Embassy for organizing this event and giving me the opportunity to speak. And thank you, Under Secretary Azra for this really powerful remarks on the current situation inside Tibet. So I won't go into too much detail about it, but as Alex mentioned, just 2 days ago, the Tibetans all over the world commemorated the 65th anniversary of the Tibetan National Uprising Day. And it's also the 35th anniversary of the martial law, imposition of martial law in Lhasa on March 5, 1989. And also the, I would say 16th anniversary of the 2008 spring protests that happened all across the Tibetan Plateau. So to give a brief historical account into what this March 10th, the Tibetan National Uprising Day means, the day is of special significance, not only to the Tibetans, to all those people who cherish peace and freedom as one of the highest human ideals. So when the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, right after that, People's Liberation Army of China invaded Tibet. And in 1951, they forced the Tibetan government under duress to sign the 17-point agreement in May of 1951. And that was the first time People's Republic of China offered the one country, two system model. And today our friends and brothers and sisters in Hong Kong and Taiwan understand that. And they remind us, yesterday it was Tibet, today it is Hong Kong, tomorrow it could be Taiwan. So the reason People's Republic of China forced that 17-point agreement on the Tibetan was that they did not have any legitimacy under the international law to invade or occupy Tibet. And today, the only claim that People's Republic of China has over Tibet is the historical claim and this 17-point agreement. And the first original propaganda, the lie that People's Republic of China used was, this was peaceful liberation of Tibet. So in their misinformation, in their, narrative, it has two versions. The first is peaceful liberation of Tibetans from feudal serfdom. The other is the peaceful liberation from imperial powers. But there were only a handful of Westerners in Tibet back then, and some of them were the employee of the Tibetan government. There was one British gentleman, Robert Ford, who was assisting the Tibetan in the radio telegraph service. But that was the first propaganda Beijing used. And from 1951 to 1959, the Tibetan people tried to live with the, People's Republic of China under that 17-point agreement. But PRC violated every law and spirit of that law, that agreement. And on March 10, 1959, not the elites, not the leaders, but the ordinary Tibetans, unarmed Tibetans, formed walls upon walls of human bodies around the Nubulinga Palace to protect the life of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. For the Tibetans, he symbolizes the very heart and the soul of the Tibetan nation. And on March 17, 1959, the Dalai Lama escaped from Lhasa under cover of darkness, and he reached India at the Indian border on March 10, 1959. And that's when Tibet lost its country, but the world, as they say, gained His Holiness the Dalai Lama. That has been the story of the Tibetans. And Madam Under Secretary mentioned, as we speak, what's happening in Derge County, how the Tibetans are being evicted from their ancestral homelands because of a dam construction. And the Tibetans have lived in that place for centuries, perhaps for millennia. And this is the site of 6 monasteries, some of them as old as 13th century and earlier than that. And that's the plight of the Tibetan people today. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama, from a very early on, he tried to find a mutually beneficial solution to the Tibet issue. And the Tibetan administration is committed to His Holiness' middle way approach. They try to seek a mutually beneficial solution to the Tibet-China dispute or conflict. And here he wants to, His Holiness' vision, that approach avoids the current status quo and the pre-1950 Tibet, but is trying to work within the framework of the People's Republic of China, the Constitution, and its 1984 regional national autonomy law. And from 2002 to 2009, we have had 9 rounds of talk, but in the end, Beijing was not really serious about its intention. And that's when the Tibetan people inside Tibet protested. They fully supported His Holiness Dalai Lama's middle way approach, but the people inside Tibet knew that the Chinese leadership was not really sincere about its intention. It's around 2006 when the Beijing authorities tried to, implement more draconian policy, and that's when Tibetan people all across the plateau revolted or peacefully protested. And if you look at the past 4 decades, the Tibetans have resisted China's rule. They have never accepted Chinese rule, but His Holiness has been trying to find a way forward. And that's, I think, the whole story. And under Xi Jinping, whatever nominal autonomy the Tibetan used to enjoy is now completely eroded. And now, in November of 2011, the Central Committee of the Communist Chinese Party came out with a resolution that is totally an opposition of China's own constitution and its own laws. And that's what we are facing today. And we really appreciate the support of the people of and the government of United States and Canada for its support to the Tibetan cause. As His Holiness always reminds us, people who support Tibet are not necessarily pro-Tibet or anti-China, they are pro-justice. And I will stop here. I have my colleague, Dr. HRREC, who I normally call a walking encyclopedia on Tibetan history, and she has had a lot of experience in working in Tibet. So I'll defer the rest of my time to my colleague, Dr. HRREC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chodab, for that those words, which I think powerfully grounded us in history, but also, and very importantly, grounded us in the perspective and experience of people on the ground in Tibet. So thank you for that. And over to our walking encyclopedia.
Get this right. Oh,
Everyone rushes.
I know. Thank you. Great. I think it does make a difference. So I want to also say how honored I am that we're gathered here on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory today in a very unique gathering. I could not have envisioned it myself. And here we are with representatives from the US government as well as the Canadian government to talk about Tibet. It does feel, as Professor Nev has said, very timely. And I am so grateful for all the comments already made. I was deeply moved to hear the keynote address by the Undersecretary of State. She has laid out the core issues so that I think this is the basis of what the conversation is today. Joya's comments were so analytically on point, and I hope that we'll get back to that as well. I also wanted to say that the representative, Dr. Namgay is someone who really, to me, as a public servant, he as a public servant shows me the relevance of the Tibetan government in exile, and so proud of the work that he does all the time. So I thought about what I could contribute to the seminar today, and what I will add to what has already been established is basically some insight, which I hope will be useful from the field. I have been doing field work inside. I did decades of field work. First started traveling there in 1987, and I take the long view of things, and I'm going to make comments about the long-term implications and effects of what we're seeing now unfolding. And there's many reasons for doing this, for taking the long view, but as a Tibetan, I also take the long view because it makes things bearable. Because otherwise, the litany of indignities that Tibetans experience, and not just Tibetans, but non-Chinese peoples all over the People's Republic of China, so many things that do not make sense, that are disrespectful, that are, in many different contexts, many different things are happening. The internment that we just talked about with the Uyghurs was first innovated in Tibet when the party secretary was the head of Tibet first, and then he got moved to Xinjiang, where then he grew and scaled up that idea for the Uyghurs and the other minority nationalities there. So there is so much that is devastating, as Alex, you were saying earlier, that it feels really important to try to see the larger picture, because that is where, as Dr. King told us, where we can see the arc of the moral universe, and that makes it bearable. So I'm going to say a few things about what I have found over many years of working inside Tibet. And let me say also, just to contextualize what I'm about to show in the PowerPoint, that this gathering also feels very significant because we are seeing right now for China itself seismic changes and how China is positioned in the global community. How it's behaving, And if it feels head spinning, it has been head spinning. And I think even just trying to assign a name to what is going on has been very, very tricky. That's why I think we have been seeing a lot of language being tried by people, talking heads and analysts who write things. We are saying many, many different things because nobody really knows. So that is the situation we're in. And if China is undergoing seismic changes, then we really need to reassess how does Tibet fit into that larger picture. So I'm going to show a couple things here, and I'm going to try pressing buttons. Okay, there we go. It does work. So the long view, I'm going to describe. So from my own experience, I had different hats working inside Tibet. One hat was through the nonprofit sector where we built a school. And this is, I don't want to indulge in talking about things that I did, but this is an example. It's a very useful case study for understanding the education policies that are being implemented today. So back in the day, this was the late 1990s, this was a typical rural school in many parts of Tibet. So in the county that we were the core field site for us, in that county, there were 50 schools like this. They were the rural schools. Then there were 3 schools that were planned to succeed relatively. And then all the other 50 schools were planned to fail, right? This was literally from our township. This is not our picture, but this is a typical picture of back in the late 90s, early 2000s, what a rural Tibetan school looked like. And honestly, having worked inside the region, parents, households would send the kids who are least helpful for the economic household. They were the ones sent to school basically just to keep them busy because they're not helpful at home. So there was a whole different idea of what education was for. And that's the state of Tibetan education in many rural and hurting areas after 6 decades of colonial rule, Beijing ruling China, Tibet, that's what it looked like in terms of their seriousness of actually being a governing body. So this is the school that we built. And I also just really quickly want to say that there was no obvious way or plan of how we were going to build this school system, which in the first year became not just the #1 school of the county, but the #1 school in the whole region of Ganzi Prefecture, which is about 1 million Tibetans. My parents were factory workers who had retired, and they cashed in my father's retirement fund to do this. So there was no actual thoughtful plan, but we did it. And so I just want to say really quickly that these kids who entered that school today are doctors, they're lawyers. We've got one brilliant bilingual Tibetan legal mind, and they are, working as administrators. They're computer programmers. They do. They're the first generation of literate Tibetans in this area. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because what we see today in terms of the education policy the assimilationism began in 2008. And that's very clear to me because that's when we started the middle school. We opened the middle school in this area. And I wanted to talk about the assimilationism going on in this context. The Chinese government has always had an assimilationist policy called Tonghua, right? For those of you who know Chinese, this was the idea. But by 2008, what happened, of course, was that there was a region-wide, across Tibet, there was uprising. And this was also the year of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which was supposed to be China's coming out party, right? Is now a member of the international community, part of the WTO, part of the international global economy. And instead, in March, every year in March, there are some kind of uprisings, but this one was Tibet plateau-wide uprisings. And so 2008 really changed so much. It was a shift in so many policies, and the assimilationism was also described differently. The Chinese technical term is different. It was no longer Tonghua, it was Ronghe. I call that neo-assimilationism, and it is what we see today with the education. And it's actually across the board. There's also a very vibrant conversation among the policy elite about sinicizing the Tibetan Buddhism. In fact, all of Tibetan Buddhism also sinicizing that, how to do that. So, so I wanted to describe this because in 2008, because of the uprising, which was pretty much a shock to the system, they did not realize or expect this to happen. For the first time in a generation, what we saw was a difference of opinion that was expressed globally by the Chinese government. So the official line was that the uprisings were caused by the Dalai Lama. He had orchestrated it. And there was all the very negative talk, the toxic language that we saw during that period. And yet, at the same time, the premier, Wen Jiabao, made a public outreach during a press conference in Laos, which was really, really surprising. He took the exact opposite approach. He demonstrated respect for the Dalai Lama, and he acknowledged that he was not responsible for the violence. And in fact, could he please help us? Tamp down what was going on. So this was extraordinary. And I think what we saw for the first time in a public way, globally public way, and at a high level, is this policy contention within the Chinese government. So the opportunity arose, very long story, but I'll just say that this is the part of the research that is about state discourse and about policy elite contestation on Tibet. There was the opportunity to do a research process, and so I developed that process. And for 7 years, we had conferences in different parts of the world, partnering with different universities around the world, talking about policy issues inside Tibet. So we also saw through this 7-year process where Tibet sits in the Chinese policy priorities, and that is at the very, very bottom. And what became clear also through this many years of discussions is to the extent to which there was interest there, and I believe there still is interest in rethinking that. And right now, the whole region, which I'm going to show you in 1 second, I think is really important to see this, is run by an anachronistic party agency, the United Front, and not by the government at all. So in a sense, it's been partitioned since the beginning and still today by an agency that is not powerful at all at the national level. At the national level, it is at the bottom of the rung. So this is part of the many, many problems regarding Tibet, which I will get to because I'm going to talk about structural issues. So this process began in Oslo. We had many, many meetings like this. But here's where I want to get to today is to talk about structural factors that I think will situate the whole assimilationism going on, the neo-assimilationism going on today in first the historical context, and then also in terms of the structural issues regarding Tibet. So the first point that I wanted to make regarding the structure of Tibet and the forms of rule that exist today, and this is all counterintuitive, that's why I'm going to go one by one, is that Tibetans across the region, which Tibetans regard as the Tibetan homeland, is basically a geophysical region. It's the Tibetan plateau. That demographic is usually not seen this way, but it is a majority of the people. So what I'm saying is that when you stand from Beijing and you look at Tibet, then Tibetans are seen as an ethnic minority of China, right? That's the typical way that we hear about it, we talk about it, that's usually perceived, when in fact, I want to show you this region here. The dark brown area there, right, which is about, so slightly less than that. That's the Tibetan plateau plus a little bit extra. But if you just look at the dark brown, that's basically the Tibetan plateau, and it's a quarter of the People's Republic of China. It's a large territory. Now, that's the one thing that I think is really important to see is that how large the geophysical region of Tibet is, right? Just the geography of it. The other part of it, though, this is really important, is that when you go and travel through this geophysical region, from almost all of the major and rural and herding areas, the majority of the people are Tibetan. Which is to say that when you stand on Tibetan territory, Tibetans are not a minority at all. They are a majority of people. So I wanted to say that relationship between the demographics and the territory is something that does make Tibet very relevant to the Chinese and how they are seeing the issue. And I think I lost the ability to click. Sorry. Wonderful. So, oh, I did it again. Great. All right. So just to show this from another perspective, this is the Tibetan Plateau when you look up from, this is India to the left, China to the right. Well, actually, Myanmar. But you can see the point is that it is, it's a distinctive physical mass. And here's an example that I think really helps to demonstrate that. This is the Grand Teton, which is a very famous mountain in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And that tippy top of the Grand Teton is it's a 14er, so it's a 14,000 foot mountain. And for most of the Tibetan plateau, the average elevation is 14,000 feet. For most of it. That's why worldwide, there is not a plateau that sticks up from the earth like this. So this is what I'm showing here, right? And yes, it is a quarter of the PRC territory. And this issue of how Tibetans regard the land, of course, has to do with how people have come to inhabit that space. There's not a lot of arable land. It's a lot of desert. It's a lot of high mountains. Even when there's not mountains, when it's plateau, but it's very, very high plateau, 14,000. So that is a part of the structural reality of what Tibet is. And the point here, I really do want to say very clearly that when you are inside Tibet, Tibetans are not a minority at all. They are a majority, usually at the level of being 90% townships that are Tibetan. So very, very few any other kinds of people except Tibetans. And so what is the implication of this regarding the neo-assimilationism that's going on? The example that really helps to understand actually is not so much about and with so much respect for the struggles that are intrinsic to indigenous communities, it is not about the indigenous communities so much in the world in settler societies like ours or in Australia, elsewhere. It's the Kurdistan situation, which, like the Tibet situation, spans a large geographical area. And the Kurdish people's inhabited areas spans Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, right? And it's that pink area in the middle. And of all of those areas, the part of the Kurdish experience that most is similar to Tibetans today in the PRC is the Turkish part. And what they have done, what the Turkish government has done, is implement a very aggressive assimilationist policy. And what that's done is basically made all the Kurds very fluent in Turkish, right? And that's what we can expect now down the road, are that Tibetans are going to be very fluent in Chinese. That was not the case when I first traveled to Tibet. I not only here in the West, but inside Tibet, I was the only person in my entire family, all ancestors. Nobody had ever spoken Chinese before, but I had learned it in school. So I was the first Chinese speaker. Anything that had to be done with local authorities, I had to do it. So that was a time when many Tibetan places, you could not find a single Chinese speaker. Now that's going to be different. We're going to have a lot of Chinese speakers, obviously, because of the language switch. But the point that I want to make is that Turkey has done this, right? And what Turkey has also created is, of all the Kurdish areas in the world, the militancy, the terrorist movements have come from Turkey, not from Iran, not from Iraq, not from Syria, right? So one of the issues I'm trying to underline here is that in the short term, how incredibly critical and compelling it is. And I'm myself as a Tibetan feeling so much gratitude for all the work that all these different organizations and the governments are doing for the human rights conversation and pushing the Chinese government to see and to react and to acknowledge what is happening is so important. In the longer term, they need to hear, and I'm saying this to all the advocacy groups, but especially to the governments here. In the longer term, the Chinese government needs to hear that their goal, which is to sinicize Tibetans, which is to assimilate Tibetans, is not going to happen. Not in a kind of place like Kyrgyzstan, like Tibet, where Tibetans are the majority people, right? It's different if you're demographically overwhelmed, right? Then it's a different dynamic. But for the parts of the world where they are not overwhelmed, where the majority are the people who are being dispossessed, right? The dynamics work differently. I traveled through these areas and I interviewed, I didn't interview people from the PKK directly, but I interviewed people doing their research, doing PhDs on the PKK, and what they have really kind of given me so much insight into is the extent to which those who are becoming militant, who join the PKK movement up in the mountains of Kurdish areas, they are college graduates. They speak perfect Turkish, no accent, and they make these choices based on a rejection of this reality that they don't want to be part of. So this is the road that the Chinese policy right now is creating, which is to seed future conflict. And I think that the Chinese government needs to hear more often, not just, oh, you're succeeding and Tibetans will be engulfed, but many will be engulfed, but many more won't be. And Tibetan is a very strong language. And even if people cannot, because they haven't got the proper education, they won't be able to write in Tibetan very well, but they will be speaking Tibetan. And there will be this incredible political effect of seeding conflict for the future going down the line. And the Chinese government is not aware of this because they don't seriously think about Tibet at all. It's so far down their policy priorities. So this is one of the things that I wanted to convey, how important it is for internationally for us to get that message across. So I wanted to point out these issues. Connecting to that is China's fiscal policies already changed. It used to be that anybody graduating from university would be eligible for a government job. That is finished, that time is done. So people do not have that iron rice bowl opportunity anymore. So that is also another reason why Tibetans are going to behave very differently in the future. There are no jobs, unemployment is dramatically rising. And then as a separate issue is China's rapid demographic decline, which is, as we all know, spectacular. It's just incredible. They're on an irreversible trend. Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences just came out with a new study with Victoria University in Australia, estimating that, and I want to be positive here, assuming the human species makes it to the end of the century, China will have a population of 597 million people. That's down from where it is right now, 1.4 billion. It's irreversible because of all of the one-child policy that they had implemented for so long. So this is going to have implications for what is in store for Tibet. And that is also part of the larger picture we need to be conscious of. I'm going to wrap it up really quickly, just to point out to a couple things that feel really, really critical for the policy conversation to be cognizant of as we go forward. One is China's politics of scale. It is real, it is unmanageable, and we see it in so many contexts. Just intuitively, you can think, when we talk about the very few people, the standing committee people on the Politburo, what are they really in charge of, right? What do they control? They're controlling the equivalent of the United States and Canada and Mexico, all of Latin America, all of Western Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, right? That is the scale at which, yes, you can say we want to control that, and we can control that, but how do you govern that? the Chinese government doesn't have an answer to that, and it's getting more and more mysterious how they're going to manage a succession issue. We hear a lot about the Tibetan succession issue. We don't hear enough about the Chinese succession issue. They have changed their constitution. They have consolidated and concentrated power to an extent that they don't even recognize the system that they have anymore, right? So how does this happen? Nobody knows. So what we have been seeing, and again, needs to be part of our consideration of developing a strategy for engaging with China, is fragmentation in the Chinese state, decentralization of the Chinese state, where there is a coalescing of governance in different regions, very giant regions, which would be separate countries had there been an opportunity, but it's all within one giant state form, authoritarian state form. So these are the structural issues that are going to have enormous ramifications for Tibet. And what I want to put out there as a part of the conversation is that we do need a new strategic vision for a global Tibet policy that can draw on all of these kernels, sort of these hard structural, they could be socioeconomic, it could be political, social kind of factors that are changing what the Chinese state looks like, how it operates, and therefore what Tibet can look like in the future. And I've done it again, but this is pretty much the end of it, sorry. So thank you so much. I did, it's okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rabgay. As promised, encyclopedia, but such a thoughtful and wide-ranging analysis of so many of the crucial factors that really lie at the heart of, I think, why we've come together this afternoon. So thank you so much for that. We now have an opportunity to engage with our two panelists, and that's over to you. If you have some questions that you would like to pose, you'll notice we have a microphone here. So just to make sure that everyone can hear well, I'll ask you to come to the microphone. I think we can, I'll come back and join you, and I think we can take the questions from our seats. And maybe while people are kind of thinking about what they might like to ask, I'll start off with one, which maybe I'll pose to both of you. And that is this. We've obviously come together today in a spirit of US-Canadian connection and collaboration with respect to Tibet, very personified by our esteemed keynote speaker, opening remarks from representative from Global Affairs as well. We have both of you based in the United States, but clearly with strong Canadian awareness and connections. And I think one of the things we're hoping to grapple with in this seminar then is, are there opportunities, well, is there a need, but also are there opportunities for different, enhanced, strengthened US-Canadian collaboration with respect to advancing the changes we need to see with respect to Tibet? We've heard that there's an upcoming example of that in Canada and the US coming together around the event at the Human Rights Council, but wondering what your thoughts might be about that more widely. And you do each have a microphone.
I'll try to give a go at that. I think as Director General Joya mentioned, and Madam Undersecretary mentioned too, kind of like working, like-minded countries working together, and you gave the example of UPR. I think it's very important to call out Beijing for its human rights violations at every occasion. And for a long time, Beijing has taken advantage of what you say, the liberal societies, and it's picked on individual countries to do, push its narrative, its agenda. So it's time for the rest of the international community or the free world to really stand up and have a coalition and united voice. Otherwise, Beijing has been getting away at that for some time now. And these platforms are very important to call out PRC. And also, we are talking about the rules-based international order. That's the only system we have. If it's not working, as Secretary Anthony Blinken said in his remark a year ago about if this is not working, then how should we kind of like reform it, make it work? Otherwise, Beijing has been taking advantage. On the one hand, when it serves its purpose, it loves to talk about international law. But when it doesn't serve its purpose, it violates and it gets away with it because the rest of the free world are divided, don't have a united voice. So in that sense, this kind of coalition, not just USA, Canada, but also the free world, the democratic, what you say, world, especially transatlantic cooperation is very important. So does that kind of address? I can go.
I will just add that in the initiative on Tibet's governance that I was putting together for 7 years, one of the things that really struck me was the fact that all of the international interventions that happen every time that they're called out, they not only make note of it, but it is seriously thought about and discussed in other meetings that they will deny. And that really should be something that I think folks who have that ability, who have the office and can articulate those demands and the issues, the events that happen, should not take the toxic reaction that I'm sure you're getting all the time from the people that you talk to as a sign of this not being an important intervention. I think that the lesson that I took away from this is every time that there's an opportunity, it should be raised, and they are making note of it. It has an impact.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rakpai, for your very, very informative presentation. And I learned something from it that was really, really interesting and important. You mentioned Wenjiabao's opening to Tibetans, and in particular is, I would say, extended hand briefly to the Dalai Lama. So to what extent that was an exception and he changed his mind, or that he always had this view of eventually engaging into negotiation with him, and to what extent he couldn't go further because he was about to resign, right? So I don't know exactly in what year he made that call. You said 2008, right? Okay, so my question is, of course, in the current administration of Xi Jinping, we don't really see that possibility emerging, but could you say something about what would be within the Communist Party, the actors that would be more likely to engage with the Dalai Lama? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm André Laliberté, a professor here at the University of Ottawa. I'm teaching Chinese politics of Asia, and identity issues as well. So really interested by your talk.
Oh, very good to meet you after reading your work, and yeah, it's very nice to have you here. Wen Jiabao's statement in Laos was so striking because it was a planted question. Obviously, they only answer planted questions. But even with the other questions that he was answering, it was sort of normal speed. But this question, when the Tibet question was raised, and we were all alerted that he's about to say something, so please watch. So we watched, and he slowed right down. Every word was planned. And that was a moment that it was just weeks after the uprising in March of 2008, way before the Olympics. I think that for me, that's the reason why the engagement with the Chinese State Council Policy Group for the Development Research Center was worth the risk and worth the effort, because he was the head of the State Council at the time. I think the next 7 years of hearing the different conversations that they were having, what it made clear to me is that there are a lot of stakeholders that are interested and that also feel very strongly that they are on the wrong track. so many people, not just from the DRC group. They were the ones that partnered with the World Bank writing China 2020. So they're very well known to be reform-minded research institution. But many others, including the Zhuangyan Dangxiao, the main party school, people in the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, the Guojia Mingwei, and so many different institutions have said that we are really messing this up, and that we need to get back on track to talk to the Dalai Lama. And how do we do that? But it's nobody's job to do it. And in the meantime, they have a big problem. That problem is China. And I think that's something else that we underestimate, the degree to which they, in their leadership, the form of leadership, are not very, very comfortable. In which case, something ginormous and would have historic impact, would also be a huge risk, which they don't know how to manage, is Tibet, which they know is this size. I know that there's been so much written in our international conversations about this is the exiled Tibetans' fantasy, and therefore no wonder Beijing doesn't want to talk to the Dalai Lama, but the Chinese know that it is this size, and they know this because of the uprisings. Most of them happened outside of TAR, also the self-immolations, most of them happened outside the TAR, so they got it, that our problem is this big. Right. And I do think that today in the policy elite, that there are many who feel this way. However, I think the easier way, the path of least resistance, is to do what they're doing now, which is just to throw money at the problem. What they can do is build a lot of schools, build a lot of buildings, right? And all of the Xi Jinping thought. People spend all their time, schools, but also people working in all kinds of if you're working for the state, which is a lot of categories of people, right? They spend so much of their day in discussion groups talking about Xi Jinping thought. It's such a waste of labor that right now, I think that this shows that they don't have the ability to take it seriously. But if there's any change, I do think that in terms of their thought, in terms of the thinking, all of the past decades of effort internationally has had such an impact.
Thank you first, everyone, Madam Undersecretary, for this event. We're really, I think it's giving our work in Ottawa a big boost in terms of positioning Tibet. Sorry, my name is Sampe Lalongpa. I'm the chair of the CTC. What it means is I'm the oldest guy there. Just one observation, if I may. Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation, Trishla. I've always been a great fan of your work. And so aren't we glad as Tibetans that the altitude is from 10 to 14,000 feet? If it was at, 1,000 feet above sea level and you could grow rice, we'd be inundated. But nobody wants to grow barley and live with yaks at 10, 12,000 feet. So I'm grateful to that. So that aside, since for years we've heard from the Chinese that they're bringing economic development to Tibet. Very hard to get disaggregated data, but from your work, did you get a sense of what the income distribution still is in terms, and what is the benefit ratio for Tibetans participating, or are we inhabiting the lowest rungs of the Chinese economy? The other thing is, did you look at, you said Tibetans are a majority, but are the Chinese majority in the governance structures? Because 60 years afterwards, it's preposterous that the chair of the Communist Party of Tibet is Han. That alone speaks to the failure of their policies. But I would like your insights, because I only went once to Tibet and then that was it.
So on the question of the Tibetans in powerful government positions, obviously none, right? The most key positions, especially in the party apparatus, but also in the governance structure, the government apparatus, is not Tibetan. There's no question. So my point wasn't really about how power is organized. Definitely Tibetans, I mean, this is a situation of dispossession. But I'm talking about the underlying who is there, right? And I think that often we're not, especially when we talk about assimilationism, and if we are thinking in terms of how we see settler societies organized here, like in Canada, the US, Australia, et cetera, we may make that analogy really easily, right? But it's not like that. It is overwhelmingly actually Tibetans ruled by a tiny group of mostly Chinese, sometimes other Hui or other kinds of nationality minorities as well. Sorry, what was your other question? Oh, the economic, changes. Well, every time there's a major unrest, there's always a new kind of policy unrolled, right? That is supposed to be addressing the development issue. Now, this is part of their problem, is that any kind of political outburst is defined as a development problem, which it isn't a development problem. But if we are going to talk about the economy, then it's been incredibly egregious. Basically, especially in the Tibet Autonomous Region, there is so little productive actual economic activity. It's essentially a hugely subsidized region that when you compare it to very impoverished other Chinese provinces like Ningxia or the neighboring provinces, they maybe are getting 25% of their GDP from the central government, whereas Tibet Autonomous Region is getting something like 110% of their GDP from Beijing, which means that all the money is just being sent. And that's a political decision, but political decisions can end. And that's what I wanted to point to in terms of the fiscal policy. It is ending, which means that Tibet is not going to be just existing off state largesse because that was a political choice, which means that what we have seen for the past 30, 40 years is not going to be what we see in the future. So that's going to be extraordinarily different. And then for most of the rest of Tibet, which is actually the majority of the Tibetan people, what we see mostly are still subsistence economies in terms of farming and in terms of herding pastoral lifestyles, which of course then raises the resettlement issues. So there's a lot going on and none of it makes sense.
I'd like to add something about the landmass of Tibet, because Beijing has used it very strategically in the past too. When former President Jimmy Carter went to when he was former president, went out to reach out to Chinese leadership to talk about Tibet. Then the Chinese president, I think it was Jiang Zemin, showed a map of Tibet. And he said, this is the landmass of Tibet. And you're asking for, Tibetans are asking for 1/4 of China's landmass. But that's very misleading. As Dr. HRREC mentioned, that Tibetan landscape, if you look at that, only 2% of the total landmass is arable, and about 60% is grasslands or meadows, not the typical grassland you have in Canada, America, or New Zealand. Tibet, very short growing period summer, so the wild livestock has basically to live on that forage for the rest of 9 months. So the 60% of the Tibetan landmass is basically grasslands inhabited by nomads for like millennia. The Tibetans have curated that landscape. So sometimes Beijing used that to score political points about how Tibetans have the gumption or the audacity to ask for 1/4 of China's landmass. But if you look at the population density, you'll find that the rest of these are all glaciers, permafrost, high mountains that forms the after the two poles, basically, largest number of permafrost and glaciers and source of major rivers in Asia. So we have to look at that context. And also related to Sampila's question about how much China's economy, development or that has helped, we have to look at how much China has taken away from Tibet in terms of, the deforestation itself until the 1980s, the benefit that China has gained from Tibet and the natural resources, extraction, hydropower. And also, if we look at the nomads, almost 1 million nomads has been now resettled, and we don't hear much about that. And this, that the impact of that resettlement is huge, causing huge, I would say, collective trauma on the Tibetan nomads. Now we hear stories of how nomad women are taking up prostitution, and it's for us unimaginable. And the breakdown at the family, alcoholism, because nomads, what they received was 3 years or 5 years compensation. But after that, they don't have the language, the skills to work and compete, because they was basically taken away from that traditional way of life. And the nomads have actually curated the landscape and helped to preserve Tibet's environment. But China's own policy of forced sedentarization has got lots of grassland degradation. So I just want to give a context of Beijing's development, their narrative about how much they have helped to develop Tibet. But if you look at the real cost, the human cost, the environmental cost, social cost is huge.
Thank you. We've got we've now got 3 speakers. We're very tight for time. So I think if you don't mind, we'll take all 3 questions and keep them as brief as you can. And then maybe you can both sort of do wrap up and respond to the 3 together.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about, first of all, a lovely presentation, very insightful. I learned a lot about like demographic, like how large Tibetans are as a demographic in PRC. So I wanted to ask about, like, from a Canadian and American perspective, how do we ensure that we're still actively calling out, as you said, PRC and endorsing religious and linguistic freedom without stepping on the toes of PRC and possibly closing doors for further negotiation to promote these values? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Arya Gunde. I'm from this CHUO, the campus radio station. My question was, we're looking at this re-education assimilation policies. The succession of the Dalai Lama is a question that's being asked because the CCP is obviously going to try to interfere. So just a question about what the future of His Holiness is to the Tibet people.
So I also wanted to say thank you all for being here. Mrs. Uzberzea, Namgal Chodop, and Tashir Abdi. You're all very welcome here, and there's been some great insights to hear what you all have to offer. I think it's been quite educational for all of us. And I know that you're low on time, so I'm gonna keep this very quick, but my question has to do with like the sinicization you've talked about, how the Chinese government is trying to encourage Han Chinese people to populate provinces across their country. That's obviously the case in Guangdong and Fujian, but also in more remote areas like East Turkestan or Xinjiang province, as they call it. Like they offer job opportunities and benefits. So Tibet is still like a 90% majority Tibetan region, but what special hope is there for Tibet to resist such attempts from the Chinese government to destabilize the demographics?
Question to you. Yes. But regarding these other 2 excellent questions, first, regarding the demographic issue, so they have tried. It's been 70 years, actually, since China has been and basically annexed Tibet after the invasion and incorporated Tibet into the Chinese state, right? So it's been a long time, and that effort to populate Tibet has been unsuccessful. So as we were talking about earlier, somebody else mentioned that there's the governing ruling elite, right? And that's also a rotating door. It's not like people go there and then they stay there. They leave and then somebody else comes in. So that's a rotating situation. And overwhelmingly, the Chinese who have been in the Tibetan region have been migrant laborers who come because there's so much disposable income in the Tibetan region because of the fiscal policy to basically throw money at the problem, which means that now that the money is now declining, that the likelihood of having those people migrate into Tibet becomes less and less likely. In fact, that's anecdotally how we have found the situation, which is fewer and fewer Chinese, right, in rural and hurting areas. And the other part of it is that the recent census also demonstrates that, which is that there is actually a decline in Han Chinese population in Tibet. But that doesn't mean that that there isn't the intention to do that, but they just can't do it. And especially now because the Chinese economy nationally is on a decline. It's changing structurally things everywhere in terms of how their labor force is able to function, and who is actually now going to take that that journey to Tibet and try to live there. It's fewer and fewer Chinese. And on the other wonderful question, oh, sure.
I know because there's an airport deadline, we're about to lose the undersecretary. And I just didn't want to let that happen without saying again, I'm going to let that happen, don't worry. But again, saying thank you so very much. I know we all enjoyed this greatly.
Thank you. And just to finish off the question about how to engage without stepping on the toes, I think that there are many ways. And I think that depending on, if you're a person inclined to do research or you want to be in government or however that is, I think that showing a longer term commitment to these issues means a lot. And I think that also civic engagement means a lot. I know that the work that I did in the nonprofit sector was a major factor in there being all kinds of interlocutors for the work that I do, because that felt like it was a trust issue. And so much of it is about trust and confidence.
I thought Dr. HRREC's presentation kind of addressed the question about His Holiness succession. We should be more worried about Xi Jinping's succession. Okay, joke aside, so Beijing will definitely try to, select the 15th Dalai Lama because they have selected the 11th Dalai Lama, I mean Pension Lama, yeah. But the Pension Lama that Beijing selected in 1995, he doesn't have any legitimacy in Tibet with the Tibetan people. So Beijing will try to, select and impose its Dalai Lama on the Tibetan people. But the Tibetan, in the eyes of the Tibetan people, he won't have any legitimacy. That's a fact. And in terms of what Canada and the rest of the international community can do is, United States has a law, Tibet Policy and Support Act of 2020, that specifically says the United States won't, that the provision says it won't tolerate any, political interference in the, succession of Dalai Lama. It'll be up to His Holiness and his followers to select the next Dalai Lama. And that law says it will sanction whoever politically interferes with the succession of the Dalai Lama. So that's a law that the United States has passed. And it'll be wonderful if Canada could adopt a similar position. And that's something we'd really like to see. And that's something we're pushing with European. The European Parliament actually passed a resolution on His Holiness succession. And many Buddhist community has come out with the resolution basically saying that it'll be His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his follower that will choose the next Dalai Lama. And as for the Tibetan government in exile, or CTA, it came out with a 6-point statement in September of last 2022, where it says this is something spiritual and it's basically up to the Dalai Lama to decide whether there'll be a next Dalai Lama or not. Now, the issue of succession of Dalai Lama is based on the idea of rebirth, and it's a tradition or a concept that's uniquely Tibetan and spiritual. So it's up to the Dalai Lama to decide. And he has said when he reaches the age of 90, he might leave some specific instruction. Right now, his only says he's doing fine, he's doing great. He'll live up to 113 years old. So basically, we have to wait and see who will outlive whom, the Communist Party of China or the Dalai Lama. So, thank you.
Thank you to both of you for so adroitly wrapping up those three questions. I'm going to invite up my friend and colleague Sampe Lalungpa, who's going to be saying a few final words on behalf of the Canada-Tibet Committee. And while he's coming up, since it's the last time I'm going to be at the microphone, I just want to add my own words of thanks. Once more, first and foremost, for our three, the Undersecretary who has departed, and our two incredibly thoughtful and insightful panelists. I'd like to very much thank the organizations that have co-sponsored this remarkable event, the Canada-Tibet Committee, the US Embassy, and here at the University of Ottawa, the Center for International Policy Studies and the Human Rights Research and Education Center. And I'm not going to go through the list of all of the individuals, but there's a lot of people who put a lot of work into pulling this off, logistically, practically, putting together the substantive program at the US Embassy, here at CIPS, and I think we all owe great appreciation to them. And I, above all, want to give a shout out to my dear friend and amazing colleague. Stand up. No. You, Sharap Thurchin, with the Canada-Tibet Committee, who you can see automatically wants to sit down because he's always doing incredible work behind the scenes, including for this event, and it's much appreciated.
So I have the most difficult task when everyone wants to go, and then I have to apparently sum up. But how do you sum up such a rich set of presentations? I won't even try, because I think you will carry the resonance with you. What I will say, apart from thanking, and also Alex Neve and others for helping us, in addition to, of course, the Undersecretary and then the CTC and our other Tibetan friends, here's a shout out to our GAC colleagues, because they have, if you look at the role they played behind the scenes and to make this happen, we've had participation at a tremendous level, interest at a tremendous level, and it's really heartening for us who are Canadian. Yeah, whenever I go to lobby in Parliament, I don't sit outside as a foreigner, as a Canadian. Anyway, recommendations. So there are several recommendations that we are looking at, and I think we'll take it forward. There are activities to take forward, strengthening, calling on Canada and Canadian Parliament and governments to do more. I think the synergy is tremendous working with the United States, because we have also different sets of strengths. And the one thing I want to share is that when we talk about decentralization and other terms, this country in the G7, G8 is one of the most innovative countries in terms of that. We can stand up and talk about 2 nations or 3 nations in this country, and no one's going to jail you. In fact, it's very much what, so sometimes we're modest, but I think we bring a huge buffet to the table. So thank you, and thank you all. And I'm going to give you all this, so.